The best way to understand how to keep your home from being a loss during a wildfire is to understand how homes ignite. There's a lot of really interesting research that's gone into this. If you go to firewise.org, you can look at some of that research. There's a guy named Jack Cohen, and his job is to see how he can start houses on fire. And he shoots embers at them. He does all sorts of crazy stuff. It seems kind of like a fun job to me. I just don't want to be the case study at my house, right? Okay, so there's really three things you take into account. What are the fuels, what is the weather, and what is the terrain? So the fuels come in a couple different flavors. So you have the surface fuels. So that's your dead needles, your grasses, that type of stuff. Anything that's going to have a fire creep along the ground. When you get into ladder fuels, then you're talking about things that move the fire higher up into the trees. A ground fire is much easier to fight than one that's up in the crowns of the trees. And then of course you have the crown fuels, which are the trees themselves. Once a fire gets into the trees, there is not a lot a firefighter can do. They pretty much stand back. And Guy, chime in whenever if you want. When did you go? Okay, chime in if I miss anything. The thing with crown fuels, what they do, a lot of people think that it's the flame, the actual flame touching the house that starts the house on fire, and that can be the case. But what you get in crown fires is you get these ember showers, and these fires put out embers, anywhere up to a mile in front of the fire itself. And that is what a lot of people don't think to protect against, are those embers, and where those embers can land and where they can find a great place to hang out. And sometimes the flame front may pass the house is fine, but what gets it in the end is the embers that were left behind the flames. Okay, the other piece is weather. So this is a little bit hard to read, the colors are off, but this is the most recent drought report from all these folks here. You can see that we are in a severe drought. This definitely contributed to the way that the Carlton complex moved. Things were so dry. We'd had that 100+ degree weather that just baked all the moisture out of the fuels. Then we had the wind come in. We had very low humidity. All of those things are a recipe for intensifying fire. So if you're especially in an area where we get droughty conditions, which is typical in our summer, right? We don't get a lot of rain in the summer. But this was a really strong drought, and it continues.
Is the brown, is that even more drought?
Yeah, so California's got it really quite terrible. That's extreme and exceptional, right? So we're in severe and moderate, and then just over here it's just abnormally dry. So we hope that we don't start to look like this. So again, this is a contributor to higher fire danger. So when you start seeing drought conditions like this, it's sort of a cue to think about, okay, what else do I need to do to protect my home? And then terrain. So where your house is situated on the terrain makes a huge difference. If you're on a slope, or even maybe your deck is hanging out over a slope, fire likes to move uphill. It moves uphill typically faster. Carlton complex, we got to see some downhill fast-moving fire, which is pretty out of the ordinary. Another place you want to watch for is what's called a chimney, and it's that little dip, right? So what that does is it funnels air. And at my place, I've got quite a few kind of drainages, and a lot of times in the summer, you'll feel the cool air move down those drainages in the evening, and it'll kind of warm air will move up during the day. That's the same path that fire could potentially take, because that's a chimney. It's acting to move air back and forth. So you have to think about where are you located related to that. And again, is it a very steep slope or is it a more moderate slope? The steeper the slope, the faster the fire is likely to move up towards your home. Okay, so one way to think about your Firewise space is this home ignition zone. And it's basically what it says here, your home plus everything around it in 100 to 200 feet. And this is based on some of that research that Jack Cohen did about how close that radiant heat from a wildfire needs to be to ignite a wood wall. So typically it's 100 to 200 feet depending on the fuels. Okay, so that's how close. The flames don't have to be next to your wood wall. It can be 100 feet away, and just that intense heat could ignite that wood wall. So that's why we really focus on kind of the zone around the home. This is defensible space. You also hear this term a lot. So that's a place where you have modified the vegetation and the landscape to really create a space that you or firefighters could be in and feel safe. you won't be immune to an ember shower, but you are likely to be in a place where firefighters can make a stand. So what is defensible space and how do you get some? So you want to look at that 100 to 200 feet between your house. And the first question is always, well, how much do I need? And that really depends, again, on your slope, your fuels, kind of where in the woods you are. So here you can see that if you're on a flat piece of ground surrounded by grass, 30 feet defensible space is your minimum. That's a good choice for you. But if you're getting into a much steeper area, you may want 100 feet, even if you're just surrounded by grass, which is a very fine fuel that burns quickly, but not very hot. Same if you're in a forested area and it's flat or very gently sloping, again, 30 feet is usually enough to be a good defensible space. But the more steep you get, the farther out you want to go with some of that work that you do on your trees. Now this doesn't mean chopping down every tree within 200 feet. This means modifying the vegetation so that fire can't get up into the crowns and really just reducing the likelihood that fire is going to get so big that it can't be fought. So, when you figure out about how big you think you need for your space, and I should also say it depends a little bit on what your house is constructed with. So if you have wood walls, you probably want a little bit more space versus if you have stucco or fiber cement siding, you have a little bit more leeway just because your walls are not flammable. So, dead vegetation, do you have any? Needles and leaves are dead vegetation. This is something you don't want to see building up on your roof or in your gutters or on the ground next to your wood siding. You also want to do as much as you can to remove dead branches and dead shrubs in that defensible space zone. Now, when you look at something like this in your landscape, how concerned would you be about this one log down around your structure?
Not concerned.
Not particularly concerned. I mean, if the fire comes up to it, it's actually going to stop and kind of burn that log for a while. It's more the needles. If you had a continuous path of needles right up to your structure, that would be more of a concern for you because that brings the fire to your door. So is there dead vegetation on your roof or in your landscape? So you can remove that there. Now you notice this snag out here is still there. That's out of that defensible space zone. And snags, if you are here because you value wildlife and you like seeing wildlife, then you may want to keep a snag or two in your field of view for your woodpeckers and stuff like that. A lot of this comes down to your personal choices and what you want from your property. So everything we say here, you have to filter it based on what you want. You can build a perfectly wonderful Firewise space, but it'll look like a bunker with no trees, and that's probably why none of us moved here. So, okay. So now, is there dense vegetation? How far out can you see from your property? If you've got something that looks like this, you're really going to want to create a separation between plants. Because when it's thick like this, basically the fire can start at one end and move completely through all of this fuel. And if that's leading up close to your house, then you have a continuous path of fuel leading to your home. Okay, so you want to take something like this and make it a little bit more like this. Think about it as sort of defensible space in the sky, kind of like these little alleys. If you look up between your trees, you want to see 5 to 10 feet of blue sky in between. You can have clumps of trees, but make sure that those clumps are separated from other clumps by 5 to 10 feet. So that if the fire did get into a canopy, it would stay in that canopy as opposed to spreading to every other. So we go from this to this. A lot more fire lines. Do you have ladder fuels present? So do you have grasses and shrubs that will lead into your trees? And that's pretty much what they do. So here's an example of some dead material as well as some live material that is leading up to the green material here. Now in general, the dead material isn't going to burn as fast as the green material. But still, something like this, there's a lot of needles on the ground. The needles can light up and then get into those dead branches and then up into the green branches, and those will go whoosh. So are there ladder fuels present? Take them out. Turn them up. So take something like this, make it like that. And typically we say anywhere between 8 and 14 feet, but never take more than 50% of your tree's canopy. So if you have a small tree, you're gonna have to start, a couple feet here, and then as it gets taller, you can take a couple more feet and go up with the tree. Because the last thing you wanna do is a lollipop tree, because it'll just die. It only has like this much left on the top. Not gonna work very well. Okay, and then step 5, is there a lean, clean, and green zone? Basically, do you have space around you that is either lawn or has been really well maintained, it has very few plants in it, maybe it's got some rock and block type of stuff. So when we say lean, we mean just a little bit of flammable vegetation. So really keeping that down. Clean is that you have very little dead stuff. And green is that you are watering your plants and keeping them healthy during the season. Or you're picking plants that are really drought tolerant, and so they don't need a lot of water, which is a good choice for this plant. So you can see that we've added the lawn here, and then we've got some garden plants that are not typically very flame, they're not very.
So did you say the live trees burn faster than dead trees?
Yeah, green material in pine and conifer trees, it has all those volatile oils in it. And so they will go up faster. A dead branch on a pine tree is going to take a lot more constant flame contact for you. So.
And what's the size of
The lean, clean, and green zone. It depends on what your structure is made out of. It depends on whether you have irrigation and you want to maintain that irrigation. But probably in that, I would say 30-foot sort of minimum space there. That's what I'm doing at my house. Is I've got a little rock wall that I built 30 feet around, and that's kind of my fire break. And then everything in there I'm trying to keep fairly well mowed down and just very small. This is a really good resource. We have these, you can get them online, and I think that we brought some today. Everything will burn if it gets hot and dry enough, but there are some plants that are better Firewise plants than others. This is what you would find in a fire-resistant plant. And luckily a lot of our natives out here are pretty fire-resistant. So like serviceberry and things like that. So they don't get a lot of dead vegetation, they're very open, they're not that oily, waxy stuff. So bitterbrush, sagebrush, pine, those are all examples of things, the ceanothus that's out here, the buckbrush. Those are all plants that have a lot of volatile oils, and so those are the ones you definitely want to kind of get out of your defensible space zone as much as you can, because those go whoosh as well. They go much faster. Stuff with a high moisture content, so most of your garden plants, are very succulent, have a lot of water in them, and stuff that grows slowly. So here's an example of one. So this is our native serviceberry or Saskatoon. That's a good fire-resistant plant. Chokecherry, same thing, another native. Great fall color. Here's a landscaping plant. It's a succulent, so you can see all those tissues are full of water, right? So it's not going to burn readily. This is creeping Oregon grape, another native. Also fire resistant. Mock orange. You guys see that one? Okay, what do you think about this one?
No.
Firewise? No. Guy, what do you guys call these?
Gas cans.
Little green gas cans. Yes. If you've ever peered into those, like pulled them apart and looked for the trunk, you just see all that dead stuff in there, right? Yeah, so they're terrible. And too many people plant these as, like a privacy screen right next to their house.
Is that arborvitae?
It's either an arborvitae or a juniper. So, but similar, very similar.
I have a question.
Sure.
On these Firewise plants, the serviceberry, Oregon grape, and chokecherry, like those are often in kind of the more riparian zones. And one thing that I've just been curious about going and looking at this last fire, it burned really hot through some of those areas and decimated some of them. And so I'm wondering, we're in pine forest,
right,
and there's a lot of that, at least around our house. And I'm just wondering if there's a degree to which at some point, like they're good, but if it's been dry, if they can actually be worse, or
I don't know that they would be worse just because they don't have the oils in them, but absolutely everything will burn if it gets dry enough. And even the wax currant, which is native to here and is typically very fire resistant, this year it's super dry. It has more, it has dried up on my property, the leaves, more than I've ever seen it before. I mean, it looks like winter time. because they're so desiccated right now. So yeah, they wouldn't particularly be fire resistant right now.
Yeah,
So
and
again,
I'm
it
almost,
goes
yeah, it
back
almost
to
seems
what's
like
the
it's,
weather condition, you know?
yeah, like they've even moved, the fires almost moved hotter through those areas than even the ponderosa pine, like around it.
Interesting, yeah.
One of the things on that is typically the conifer is the first thing that will carry a heavy, high intense fire. So as we go throughout fire season, the shrubs will start becoming more and more of a role in that. The other thing, depending on where you live, your aspect and other things, a lot of areas I don't see the shrubs being a major contributor every single year. On a really, really bad year, clear cutting pavement is about the only thing you can do. But none of us want that. So what we're trying to do is what will work most of the time. Make it resilient and we survive with a high degree of success most of the time. Good observation on some of those shrubs. It sounded like this year for that 1 week we had perfect conditions for everything to burn very, very readily. I mean, when we get those conditions like that, they don't happen every year. They don't happen every week or every August. But we just try to do the best we can to lower those things so you can still get the other things you value on your property, which is that, and typically the service-berry stuff will burn less intense than the conifer trees. A lot depends on how much needles there are on the conifers. I think there's a couple of different factors in that.
Would you recommend a metal roof as a fire retardant as well?
Oh yes.
Yeah, we're gonna get into some building stuff after we do the landscaping for sure.
Yeah, on these plants that are fire resistant, how much difference does it make if you irrigate these plants?
The healthier they are and the more water content they have in them, the more resilient they're gonna be.
So could a bitter brush become a safe plant in your zone if it's watered and trimmed up?
I would, they have resin soils.
Yeah, the problem with bitter brush is it's got that resin in it that it's like turpentine or similar to it, right? And that just, it's a flashing fuel, they call it, so it just burns very, very hot. Its other name is greasewood. So you can picture kind of a grease fire versus a campfire.
You can't change the condition of the plant per se on its flammability content, whether it has oils. You can change whether how much moisture it has. Same with conifers and some of the other ceanosis stuff. They just have this resinous oil that gets certain hot, the oil releases, period. It doesn't matter how much you water it. It's the oil that we're concerned about. The oil is what burns, not the leaf. The oil lights on fire first, burns the tree. And it doesn't matter how green your tree is, the turpentine gases of those oils will ignite that tree no matter what. Now the condition is if you're watering your plants, like pine trees, people ask me, how close can I have a pine tree in my house? I go to ask, well, how's that pine tree going to catch on fire? That pine tree is surrounded by 30 feet of grass, well, it's not going to, in an irrigated setting, it's still just as flammable as every other pine tree, but how is it going to start on fire? Same thing with bitter brush. If it's in your landscape and you can't get fire to it readily, how is it going to start on fire? If you can say, I can't figure out how it's going to start on fire unless an arsonist comes put a match underneath it, then it might be okay. You know, that's one of those criteria I look at is how will it start on fire if you want that near your home.
So there has to be a fuel under the bitter brush to start it up, huh?
Normally, yeah.
Yeah.
It's sort of like trees. The only way a tree will catch on fire is something below it catches on fire or it goes tree to tree to tree.
Right.
But that first tree has to start from a ground fire.
Right.
What about an amber?
Embers
in the tree couldn't do it?
One thing is, mistletoe, have you guys know what dwarf mistletoe is?
Yeah.
It's a native disease. There are some studies in common sense says heavy mistletoe on trees may catch on fire because of embers, because mistletoe trees form what we call witch's broom. Pine needles fall into it, so you get this bird's nest that just ember landing. This scientifically, it has been proven, common sense, and as firefighters agree that makes sense. But in the big picture, it's relatively a low risk of an ember landing in mistletoe and starting the tree on fire. Again, it's what degree of risk are you willing to take? If you're, my opinion, if you're trying to manage a mistletoe starting your forest on fire, you're probably back to more of the clear-cut pavement mentality. You want no risk. Otherwise, you're just trying to live with some minimal risk.
But without the mistletoe, there's like zero risk, or close to zero of an
Close to
amber.
zero, I'm sure as
Yeah.
dealing with nature and fire, I can always be proven wrong somewhere.
Right, but you're lowering your risk if you don't have mistletoe in your trees. Okay.
Yeah, and it's when the mistletoe gets old and ugly and goes witching. Just because you have mistletoe on one branch and you just got mistletoe sticking out, as long as you don't get accumulation of dead in the tree, you're still okay.
So lawns, if you have irrigation, it can keep a lawn green, it can be effective. If you're like me and you don't have irrigation yet, basically my strategy is to keep it as green as long as I can and then weed whack it down so it's very short. So even if something lands in it, it's not going to be much of a flame carrying, and then I have a complete 5-foot space around my home that's gravel. It's basically non-flammable material. So we do a native plant sale every year at the Conservation District. You pre-order in the fall and you pick them up in the spring. And we do include fire-resistant plants. We key that out so people know which ones are which. We've started offering a native grass mix from Rainier Seeds called Greenbelt Plus that they developed specifically for that lean, clean, and green zone for folks who want to just use native grasses. I put it in at my property and I've been pretty happy with it so far. I didn't water it until the first week of July and it was still green, so it's doing pretty well. I'm pretty happy with it. It's pretty tough, but it's still nice to walk on. And then your other choice is to include as much non-flammable as you would like in your landscaping. And what's nice about this too is you can use less water if you pick xeriscaping and you go with a lot of rock garden type of stuff. It's not everybody's favorite look, but especially right close to the house, it can be a good choice. Okay, mulch is one thing to watch out for. I actually have a webinar coming up on Tuesday, I think, about mulches, and the same research guy, I think, goes out and tries to light mulch on fire, different kinds of mulch. So, and this is an area where, the fire could go past and the house is fine, but if embers have landed and smoldered for a while, this could be something that leads up to, your wood siding or something eventually catching on fire. So, as much as possible, avoid thick bark mulch or wood mulch near the home structure itself. I saw a really nice example in the Tonasket area where they had used a lot of stone, and then around the plants they had themselves in their landscaping, they had the wood mulch, to keep the moisture in and the weeds down, which is a good thing. But then they had rock all around it, so it was this kind of neat looking little island of trees and mulch. So not enough to really cause too much of a problem, but still providing the service that mulch provides for your plants. So it was a good mix and match. And then, of course, regular maintenance, everybody's favorite thing, especially when you have a vacation home and you come out and all you want to do is weed whack, right? That's the hard part. But it's definitely important. Okay, so let's talk about the buildings themselves. And this is a lot of what we're going to look at when we go out in the field, too. So again, the home ignition zone is your home and anything attached to it and anything within 200 feet, okay? So we want to think about fire-resistant materials in your roofing, your siding, and your decking, okay? So roofing is super important. That's where the majority of houses have been shown to catch on fire in a wildland fire event. There's something on the roof that caught. The other thing we talk a lot about is screening vents. Our homes are built with ventilation in them so that they don't overheat, so that you have fresh air coming in. But those vents, their whole job is to convect air through your house, right? They'll also convect embers if you don't screen those vents. So that's a really important thing. And when I was building my house, this was my biggest struggle with my contractor, was to get him to understand that I needed my vent screened. And he still didn't do it. He was like, oh, these are fine. And so I had to go back in and screen them all, which was a pain in the butt. And remove your flammables. We'll show these. So the roof is really important. Fire-resistant materials. Clay tile, metal is fantastic, and so is asphalt shingle. Pretty much that is a good roofing material. What you don't want is wood shingle. Because you can see how embers could just get up in here and have a party and just get going and then burn through your sheathing and do all that stuff. I just watched a video on home ignitions last week. And they literally covered an asphalt shingle roof with like 1.5 inches of pine needles and then lit them all on fire. The roof did not burn. All the pine needles burnt off and the shingles curled a little bit, but the fire did not get into the structure. Okay? So you want to look for, especially California has about the strongest standards when it comes to what they call the WUI code, the Wildland Urban Interface Code for construction. So I recommend that you look at California's standards if you are building or remodeling or doing anything with your home. because they rate materials and have done a lot of research on those. So shingle, the composition stuff, metal, clay or cement tile, and then it's also kind of how the roof is built. There's ways you can get a stronger roof, even if you have like the less awesome composition shingle. You can put drywall and different things. Haven't quite gotten my brain wrapped around the construction details, but like I say, go to the California websites and they'll talk about that. You also need to think about your exterior walls. So whenever possible, if you can use non-flammable materials like stucco or the fiber cement siding. If you have vinyl siding, that won't burn exactly, but oftentimes it will melt and droop. And then if you have wood sheeting behind there, that can be a risk. So those are kind of your best choices for new construction. If you have wood walls, and many homes in the Methow do, then you have to really be on top of your landscaping and create yourself a bigger defensible space. One thing to think about too is the quality of your windows. If there was radiant heat hitting those windows, would they be strong enough to withstand it? Or if, maybe just one pane would break, but luckily you have double pane, and so that would be better. Again, these vents, this is really important. So a lot of us have vents like this, and they need to be screened to keep embers out. They've done some research showing that closed eaves are more fire resistant than open eaves, especially because open eaves can sometimes attract birds and other things that will leave material up in your eaves. So protect those overhangs, protect those vents, make sure that you've got a way to keep embers from coming in. And then if you have overhangs, try not to have anything growing beneath them that could cause fire to go up and into those eaves and connect to your house. Firewood. Nobody likes to go outside in the winter farther than the porch, and that's fine as long as you have a summer firewood pile location, because this is just a big old pile of fuel next to your home waiting to go up. And I see that a lot, and we all do see that a lot. So please have a summer place for your firewood, and especially not under your deck. If you have a propane tank, you want to make sure, first off, that there is no flammable material around it, like these trees, or I can't tell if that's bark mulch or what, but have it in a place where fire really can't get to it. And if possible, try not to locate it under your eaves. From what the fire guys tell me, usually these don't blow up, but what they do is they vent. If they get too hot, especially if they're not really full, they will vent, and then if there's fire in the area, suddenly you have a blowtorch, hopefully not under your eaves, drawing up into there. So a lot of people now are doing underground tanks, and that's good too, so that's pretty well protected from there. Okay, so we're wrapping up and we're going to go out into the field, but a question?
Oh, I'm just wondering about artificial decking.
Oh, yes. So there are some different kinds of, Trex is one brand, but there's these sort of plastic lumber decking material you can get. They're not all the same. Some are more fire resistant than others. Some folks I know in the Chilliwack who they didn't lose their house. They have a lot of scorch marks on their Trex deck, but it did not catch on fire. But if you go to Jack Cohen's website and you look at some of the tests he did, there are some cheaper versions of the plastic lumber that went whoosh, and it was amazing. So again, I'd say go back to those California WUI codes and look at some of the stuff that they have. They've done a really nice job calling out specific materials that are good for building with. Decks, one thing to think about too is if your deck overhangs at all, you can screen it with 1/8 inch metal mesh to keep debris and embers from coming underneath it. If you have a deck that's very high up and it's up over, kind of hanging out over a slope, you really want to make sure that you don't have any flammable stuff that can bring the fire up under that deck, because that's a weak point in many houses. We lost houses in Okanogan that way, in town, because they were at the top of a hill with a deck overhanging surrounded by juniper. It was like the perfect storm of awful. So, you have a question?
What was the name of the gentleman that does all these tests?
Jack Cohen.
And is his website through your website?
Go to firewise.org.
Okay.
Look at this tree next to me, and I said, well, what is that tree? I know, I wasn't expecting it. I had to ask him, was this planted or natural? He says native because of the stream here. They have a little isolated pocket of western red cedar here.
That is bizarre.
One of the things that we were talking about earlier about shrubs and the ignition of shrubs versus trees and how hazardous shrubs are. one thing about shrubs and trees, if the shrub is getting a lot of moisture, you're watering it. And if I put heat to it, what does it release?
Steam.
Steam. The more moisture, the more you water it, the longer that it takes, the more duration of heat you need to get that steam to get out of it before it ignites. Where this stuff is, when it releases the gas. And all you have to do is release enough gas to ignite the gas. That's one of the reasons we were talking about earlier, this is much more concern a lot of the time because of the release of the gas. As we go higher, longer in the fire season or in a really droughty condition, the amount of moisture in this gets less and less, so it takes less duration of heat to make it combust. The more drought tolerant the plant is, the more they can hold on to that moisture and less readily burn. And that's why some of our plants we like more open, because they have less material to burn when it does hit that condition that the shrubs will burn. Here, if you look at this, in this just little area, these shrubs are still green. The chance of these burning is slim, where a lot of the Carlton fire was a more extreme condition. Definitely no cedar there, dry Doug fir conditions, and so it was a droughty condition, made it more flammable. Home and start the home on fire. Okay, we call that conduction. You touch something, it gets hot. You touch a hot frying pan, heat transfers to it, ignites the house on fire. The other way we're trying to protect these structures from fire is when you're sitting around your campfire, that heat you feel, we call that radiant heat. Okay, those are a couple ways we're trying to protect your structure from fire, and that's what the Zone 1 does. It puts an area that won't readily burn, so fire can't physically touch your structure. B, you don't want it to ignite spontaneously from that heat you feel from your campfire. And that's one of the things that Jack Cohn came up with. He said, bang for your buck. An area 30 feet that won't readily burn is ideal. Which in a community like this can be a challenge when a lot of you guys, absentee landowners, you're not there to monitor it every week, not to get someone to mow it, and a lot of lot sizes can be very, very small to get that 30-foot zone.
Yeah, so in this situation or in other places, is it actually better to have grass in that 30 feet and be watering it than to have these deciduous plants, or?
That's a tough question. Anything that won't readily burn. Rock landscape, we won't hit some of the homes way down the end that use a rock landscape. Two, while some of the book answers tell you it's 30 feet, some of the studies we did after Firestorm in Spokane 1991 was 5 foot actually made a difference. Okay. The thing is, 5 foot's for the smaller, what we call the lower intense fires, and in a fire like Carlton, just the head of it was intense, and we had miles and miles of less intensity. You know, reality, the intense part of the fire wasn't the biggest portion. It's just the portion that burnt the fastest. Most of the fires are flanking or backing. 3 sides of the fire are usually a flanking fire or backing, and generally that burns. That's the fire going outwards, a lot slower, a lot lower intense. And a 5 foot thing can benefit, but from our scoring systems that we use, we don't count it because it's not enough.
What's a 5 foot? I don't get that.
5 feet of area that won't readily burn. We've seen a lot of people who
You mean
just have,
away from the house?
yes, 5 feet away
Like
from the house.
rock?
Rock, whatever that
Crushed
won't
stone.
burn. I've actually seen people just have plain old-fashioned dirt. They just didn't. They got so little water, the soil so crappy, nothing burnt. They just never planted it. It was just naturally won't burn.
So what about the pine needles? Should they be completely removed in that zone?
Yes, anything in Zone 1. And typically what I recommend to people is do it by the 4th of July. Typically needle fall doesn't happen much after the 4th of July. And 2, what else happens after the 4th of July?
Hot.
It gets hot. Who said
Yeah.
hot?
Hot.
Yeah. How many of you guys like to work in 104 degree heat? Exactly. So if you get it done before the 4th of July, you get it out of the heat, you get it done, then you can play in vacation mode the rest of the summer. Tree bark, as mentioned, will burn. They do have some pine needles to burn. One of the things I did see, beauty bark started structure on fire once, but the siding was all the way to the ground, wood siding touching the ground.
Yeah.
There's many, many reasons why wood siding touching the ground is bad besides fire. But the beauty bark touch, i.e. you have physical touching of fire, even though it's this big of a flame, only 1 inch flame length, touching dry wood, it ignited on fire. Okay, in a case like this, the chance of fire is somewhat reduced because it's just going to hit concrete. So why I say that is, how many of you guys have unlimited time, unlimited money? Okay. So some people ask me, should I remove my beauty bark? I say, well, I first go to the trees. You know, if you're in a condition like this, if you have good sighting down to your beauty bar, now you have the ignition source that's touching the flame. Now, 1-inch flame will start a house on fire. Now, these trees have some natural defenses. The ponderosa pine to survive wildfire. One of the things is, kind of notice how I'm not touching very hard, but a lot of stuff's coming off. It's called exfoliating bark. When the bark catches on fire, it starts falling to the ground. So it makes it a challenge with a fire to climb the bark. So if you wanted to leave a tree near your home, this might be a better one, because even if fire got to the base of the tree, it has a little more challenge to climb that bark to start the whole tree on fire. Douglas fir doesn't come off, but it doesn't burn as readily as other species when Douglas fir is older. Okay, if we look at some of our, we had it earlier, younger Douglas fir, they have a lot more pitch on them, pitch pockets on them, pitchy. In the younger stage of life, they have a lot of pitch. They often have red streaks in the center of them. What we call that, the fir is busting at the seams, growing so fast. Those type of firs, the bark more readily starts on fire. So if you have that near your house, that one's a little more at risk until it gets more of this type of bark. Okay. The other thing with both these trees, the bark is very thick, which helps insulate the tree survive wildfire. 2, the ponderosa pine is a sun lover. These dead branches are the tree being mean, because if the needle they're a very inefficient user of sunlight, the needles. So if it gets any amount of shade, these needles use more energy than they produce. So the tree kills the branch. If you don't produce, you're out of here. Where Douglas fir, the needle's a more efficient user, so you have more branches in the shady environment. So a lot of times you'll get these lower branches of shading, lower branches on the tree like this, giving us what we call our ladder fuel. Landscaping, what do you think? Looks good.
Green.
It's green.
Except for the
It's
beauty
good.
bar.
Except for the beauty bar.
Beauty bar.
Okay. Sure, it doesn't look too bad. Let's ignore the beauty bark first. It's green. It's being maintained. If they were gone for 4 months without a sprinkler system,
Bad.
a bad thing.
yes, it would be. So one of the key things is what she alluded to is maintenance, especially with a lot of the absentee landowners. I've seen a lot of places like this, just great. Now someone mentioned the beauty bark. The beauty bark can be a concern. What's the chance of the beauty bark catching these green shrubs on fire? Today?
Not much.
Probably pretty low. How about the siding? And this is what kind of siding?
Cedar.
Cedar. What do we use cedar for?
Fire starter.
Fire starter. Yes. If this was metal, if this was composite, it was something else, my fear level would not that big of a deal. Risk factor is low. One thing, can you treat cedar to be fire resistant?
Yep.
Can you?
Yeah.
So I've heard mixed results on that. The other thing from a firefighter standpoint is, will a firefighter know a house is treated?
No.
No. And so one of the things what firefighters do, they often rate homes. Where can I have 2 engines and 4 homes? Which ones I'm going to save? We rate the homes on what we have a chance of saving. Cedar is one of those red flags to a firefighter. It lights so easily. If I see cedar, I often just ignore it and go try to save a house without cedar, because it just takes a lot of water.
What if you had metal and then stucco lower on the house and cedar higher up?
I ignore it. No, excuse me. The cedar doesn't factor in my brain then.
Okay.
Like if this was, if
Like
everything
4 feet up. You got
Yeah.
4 feet of stucco and metal
if-
and then upper part.
Yeah,
is-
if everything below the top of the door, down below here was rock, and that was cedar, I don't think it would. We'd probably just wouldn't even recognize it as cedar. 30 foot, we want to make one a little more, or this 200 foot of modified. Remember, we have zone 1, which is this area that won't readily burn, and zone 2 is when we were talking about the